But all I would suggest is up to you that as we get closer,
So we're here to talk about the Two Streets documentary that you feature in. I just wanted to say that I found the documentary really insightful and kind of eye-opening on the situation in the United States. And I just wanted to know what you thought about the end result of the documentary and how the general reception has been. If you've been happy with it.
With the reception of the film?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think people have really gravitated toward the message, understood that, an uprising is more than just the images that mainstream media plays on television, and that, people's lives have been forever changed around the death of Mike Brown and the Ferguson uprising. And so I think that really the reason behind the documentary was to kind of combat this idea that, we weren't organized, that there wasn't really a demand. And I think it successfully did that. I think it's had international appeal. I think it's answered questions that people had when they were watching the news in 2014 or they were on Twitter in 2014. And I think it humanizes us in a way that other mediums just could not do. And so I'm really grateful for that part, that people get to see kind of the humanistic part of being an activist, the parenting, the partnerships, the transformation on an individual level, I think is inspirational for people who are interested in stepping into that kind of work.
And has there been any, real day-to-day progress since the uprising? Has, the election of Donald Trump, for example, constituted a kind of, setback for the whole movement?
I definitely think you can contextualize the election of Trump as a response to a growing kind of racial justice movement.
Okay.
And, this kind of backlash against a left agenda. And I think if you look at a long history of America, then the same thing happens, following the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. There was a Reagan, there was a Nixon. And so if you kind of understand the states as this push and pull kind of relationship, then Ferguson was definitely a push and Trump was a push back. And so there is a large faction of people who are very content with the way that things are, who benefit from the way that things are, and there's a large group of people, which I think is actually larger, that are pushing back on this history that has really, relegated Black people to a second-class status. And so I think that relationship is still happening, that the movement's growing, it's more intersectional, there are more conversations happening all at once. There's a racial justice conversation happening, there's a women's conversation happening, there's a gun violence conversation now happening, and all these people have kind of an intersectional analysis on how these things work together around oppressing people in marginalized communities. So I think, that definitely we could say Trump is a response to that, but I think that the response to Trump is going to be even larger.
So do you see your movement as being kind of a continuation of, for example, the civil rights movement? Because I think there's a scene where we can see, I think it's a convention, and there's kind of a clash of generations. I'm not sure if you can see it that way, but we still see quotes of past activists, poets. So is it? Do you feel like it's a continuation of a long battle, or is it more specific? Generational?
Well, I think it depends on how you define it. So I think that the Black struggle movement has been in existence since there was a fight for abolition against slavery. The demand has always changed, and there's always been kind of rises and fall of organized kind of activism in response to state-sanctioned violence. I think that Ferguson started this new wave, which we call, the movement for Black lives, and I think that that's really important to contextualize. And at every intersection, there's been intergenerational struggle. Right, that people from SNCC struggle with King and SCLC around how they organized and what their method of change was. And so I think that there are always going to be these kind of tensions between generations because they have different lived experiences and different desires. So in a lot of ways, we definitely honor our ancestors, our history, our elders. One of the chants that we lead is one by Assata Shakur, who was, who came up in the Black Power movement. We get a lot of comparisons to the ways in which and the demands of the Black Panther Party. So I think that we appreciate and understand that what we're fighting for wouldn't be without previous movements. And so I'm really hopeful that the next generation sees us as a part of that long legacy.
Okay, interesting. And I guess social media has been a very new tool But what's interesting, I think, in the documentary is it's not only a tool of like communication, but also of information. And you were talking about like traditional medias and how they don't really show your narratives. But also, I was wondering, do you think like there's a problem with social media is having kind of this echo chamber, effect and limiting maybe your audience and not, having more like general change and, different more very extreme groups are having recognition through media, social media as well. And so do you think...
Well, I think mainstream media has an echo chamber too, right? That it doesn't cover what we would consider to be news. And so I think social media did a really good job of showing us the power of how to combat a narrative that's being built against you. I also think it democratized leadership in a way that previous iterations of Black struggle haven't done. That there just wasn't a king, right? That you got to opt into whether you wanted to listen to Britney or whether you wanted to follow Tef Poe or whether there was, an Ashley Yates. And so I think with that kind of diversity in leadership, it really did, it was like this mass appeal where people could say, like, I'm really invested in this person. I see them as a human. People saw Britney as a mother. Kendall was at the protest. They were saying to themselves, wow, if it's safe enough for her to lead and have her daughter, surely I can come out with my stroller, right? And so I think that there's a power to social media. And I think we made international connections with regards to people from, like countries like Palestine or South Africa where people were reaching out, giving advice. We talked to, I've met people who were doing the Fees Must Fall activism in South Africa during the same time. So I definitely think that the benefits outweigh kind of the cons of social media because it at least allowed a platform big enough to combat what was being said about us. And I think that was really important to kind of the growth of the movement at large.
Okay, that's interesting. And is kind of the underlying, so obviously, police violence and institutional racism, that's, I guess, the main subject of the documentary. And do you think, you talk a lot about democracy in the documentary, saying things like, this is what democracy looks like, and at the same time, there's this man, I forgot his name, who says that the Constitution in Ferguson doesn't exist.
Right.
So do you think it's a matter of changing completely the rules, changing the Constitution, or in a democratic way, or kind of using traditional means of protest, votes? How do you think this battle is going to play out in the long term?
Yeah, so I think we have to be moving on all cylinders, right? I think there need to be people who are deeply invested in an electoral strategy. My work has centered around electing local people into office, like mayors and prosecutors, who kind of have an immediate touch to the communities that are impacted. And then I think, there are some people who are talking about the president. I think that a mayor is much more important right now in the conversation around sanctuary and safety than a president, And so I think that then there's this conversation around what the Constitution actually means for Americans, all people who are considered Americans, when it was written and the basis that it was written on has a very racialized history, and it actually does not benefit a lot of people who we are fighting for. And so I think that they're even with the way that we elect our president, right, it doesn't give the majority the power in the nation. And so I think that there are a lot of things that America has to really reckon with. And I do think that right now we're entering a reckoning moment where we're going to have to say we need to undo some of these institutions. Policing is one of the institutions that we need to look at and radically reimagine what a new system would look like that actually is responding to emergencies, not creating new ones, right? And I think we need to look at democracy as something that actually is protecting the people, that's lifting their voice up, that's not giving results and privilege to people who have money. A presidential election in the United States costs $1 billion. If you live below the poverty line, you don't matter to the person who's running. That needs to radically shift. So I think that, again, across all institutions, housing, labor, criminal justice, education, guns, that we have issues. And we have issues because a very homogenous group has been in charge, a very privileged group has stayed in charge, in power, and I think the more that we challenge that on all fronts, the quicker we'll see kind of alternatives being tried, There's this new conversation around ICE, our immigration system, and how fast we're deporting undocumented folks, and people who are contemplating running for president in the next election cycle are being asked, should we abolish ICE? ICE is a new institution. It was created created in 2003. Surely we can get rid of something like that, and we can get rid of something much older like police, because the way that they function actually isn't benefiting the majority of the people who live in the communities that need someone to come in and actually intervene in the violence that's happening.
And so what do you make out of, for example, in the documentary there's a very powerful scene where we see a black officer, police officer, I think nearly tearing up.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any like police support from,
Yeah.
How do you make out, this like personal prejudice versus like institutional racism problem, which is not always the same?
It's not the same, and I think we weigh them the same because there's kind of this individual response that we see and we feel. A person can call you the N-word, right? But a system can completely annihilate your ability to generate wealth, right? Like, these are spectrum differences, but we conflate the two often. And so I think that, diversity, representation alone isn't going to change systems. It's not going to change institutions. We saw that because during a moment like Ferguson, we had a black president, the first black president, who often on TV looked conflicted about what it actually meant to be representative of a community that has historically been disenfranchised and out of power, and what it looks like to actually be in governance of the entire nation that's torn over issues around criminal justice. So I don't think that representation is a solution at all. I think it's been an alternative that people have introduced, right, to kind of appease people who have pushed back, right? So instead of let's actually look at the institution of policing, no, let's just hire more police from your community. But the culture of policing is like poison. Once it gets in your system, there's nothing you can do around it. You either have to conform to the way that it is, or you get out, right? And I think we've seen a lot of officers actually leave the profession and after Ferguson because they were like, this isn't what I signed up for. Like, I actually want to be able to have these conversations, and I don't want to take on this kind of language of us versus them because we're supposed to be serving them, right? And so I think that representation fails on that front. I do think, however, there's a significant amount of people within police departments across the states who are deeply invested into transforming policing, who are deeply invested in this idea of community policing, not walking around with guns on your waist, not just driving up and pulling people over, but like being in community with social services, with community organizations, with churches, kind of this holistic approach, being embedded into that kind of ecosystem in a community versus kind of this outsider within situation that police have always been. And so in that way, I think that we can see reforms coming from people who are fighting for that. I met some police officers who are retired, who are still active in their department, who have said, I actually think that person should have went to jail. I actually think that, the conversation around policing would have looked differently if prosecutors were actually indicting officers who were murdering folks. And so I think that there's, there's resistance, but there's also people within who are pushing forward. I don't think that they're in the majority, though.
Right.
And so, and I think that then we also have to challenge them to move from an individual basis to an institutional one. That it's not just one bad apple, that the whole tree is poisonous. So all apples that grow, are, as a byproduct, will be impacted.
Okay. And just maybe as a last question, I wanted to talk about like culture. You said that representation wasn't always effective. What do you think about like cultural representation? For example, there's the Black Panther movie just went out. At the end of your movie, there's a song, a documentary by Kendrick Lamar, who's world famous now.
Yeah,
do you think it's like changing kind of the general outlook of things, or is it just like a cover, kind of not very deep political change?
I think that's a good question. So I think if you look at people historically, right, who have been artists, people like James Baldwin, people like Audre Lorde, people like Nina Simone, she said, an artist must reflect the times, right? And so in that way, I do think artistry is demanding that the conversation that's happening in communities like Ferguson, like Baltimore, like Charlottesville, is actually pushing that conversation to the forefront of a nation. So you see people, you see kind of Hollywood being clumped as this like left liberal institution, but it has always been a fact that Black artists have said, I'm going to use my platform to lift up the demands on the ground around social injustice. And so I think a film, I think Marvel having to reckon with the fact that they've never had a Black director actually is really important. And so Ryan Coogler, whose first major film was Fruitvale Station, it was about Oscar Grant, a young man who was killed by a police officer. It's really important for him to make a crossover appeal because he's rooted in this idea of telling true stories about how people are impacted, right? I think you have the same thing with Ava DuVernay, whose film is in theaters now. Her first major blockbuster that we knew about was Selma, right? It was a story of Black resistance confronting a racialized South, right? Jim Crow. And so I think really it's important to elevate people like that because their politics are solid. They're going to put out representation that matters. People are going to gravitate toward it. It's important to see that Black art can be successful on an international scale because then it challenges us to really say, okay, what have I internalized as stereotypes about Black artistry or skills, you know? Like, why haven't we had more Black directors with $100 million budgets before? And so I'm really hopeful. You know, I think cultural representation is important as long as it's tied into an organizing strategy. And I do think that in that way, when I mentioned earlier that all cylinders have to be moving, but yeah, we need to be having a conversation about representation in Hollywood. We need to be having a conversation about sexual assault in Hollywood. We need to be having all these conversations in every kind of public sphere. So that we can really take them back home. And so I think that is really, I think Black Panther was a success. We actually, the Movement for Black Lives launched Wakanda the Vote during that time where we registered 10,000 people to vote at movie premieres, right? Because it's important to kind of connect this idea that we can fight for our communities with the real world where we need to fight for our communities. And so, yeah, I think cultural representation is amazing. I think it's amazing that this film, Who Streets, is produced and directed by people who didn't just come with their camera to watch, but who were actually deeply personally impacted and then saw a need to tell a story and figured out a way to get a movie made and funded that's now in London. And so I think that that's really important. No problem.
Is that okay? Yeah?